In the late 1970s, Los Angeles was already a city grappling with crime, corruption, and the fear that seemed to shadow its wide boulevards. But nothing prepared Angelenos for the wave of murders that would soon grip the city and earn the killers a name that still chills people decades later: the Hill Side Stranglers. For more than a year, young women were found dead across the hills of LA, their bodies discarded like evidence of a nightmare no one could explain. Behind those murders were not one man, but two cousins who turned Los Angeles into their hunting ground. The story began in 1977, when the first bodies appeared in the hills above Glendale and Eagle Rock. Police at first didn't know what they were looking at. The victims were women, many of them young, and all of them had been strangled. Their bodies were posed, left in places where they would be found, as if the killers wanted to taunt the city. Within months, more victims appeared. The press gave the perpetrator a name, the Hill Side Strangler, and fear spread quickly. Los Angeles was used to crime, but this felt different. These murders weren't random. They were deliberate, methodical, and terrifying. The men behind it were Angelo Buono and Kenneth Bianchi, cousins who lived in Glendale. Buono, older and more controlling, ran a small auto upholstery shop and carried himself with arrogance. Bianchi was younger, unemployed, and desperate to prove himself. Together, they built a partnership that turned into one of the deadliest killing sprees in Los Angeles history. What made them especially dangerous was their ability to trick women into trusting them. They posed as undercover police officers, flashing fake badges, telling women they were under investigation. In an era before smartphones or easy ways to verify identities, many victims went along, believing they were dealing with law enforcement. Once inside the cousin's car or taken back to Buono's house, the women were tortured and strangled. Between October 1977 and February 1978, at least 10 women were killed. Their ages ranged from teenagers to women in their 20s. Some were street workers, others were simply young women walking alone. Among the victims were 12-year-old cousins Dolly Cepeda and Sonia Johnson, whose murders shocked the city with their brutality. Each new discovery fueled panic. Parents warned their daughters not to go out at night. Women stopped hitchhiking, something that had still been common in LA at the time. For months, the city lived under the weight of fear, unsure who would be targeted next. The investigation was massive. Detectives from the LAPD and the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department struggled at first because the killings crossed jurisdictional line. Bodies were found in Glendale, Los Angeles, and other nearby communities, which meant different police departments had pieces of the case, but not the full picture. Forensic science was still limited, and while investigators suspected the work of serial killers, they didn't yet know who or how many. The press coverage only heightened the pressure. Newspapers ran headlines almost daily, and television anchors spoke of the stranglers as if they were ghosts haunting the hills. The break in the case came not in Los Angeles but hundreds of miles north in Bellingham, Washington. In January 1979, Kenneth Bianchi lured two college students to a house where he attacked and murdered them. Unlike in Los Angeles, Bianchi left behind enough evidence to be caught. When police arrested him, they realized they had one of the Hill Side Stranglers. Under questioning, Bianchi first tried to act insane, claiming he had multiple personalities. When that defense began to fall apart, he admitted that he hadn't acted alone. He named his cousin, Angelo Buono, as the partner who had helped him kill women back in Los Angeles. That revelation stunned investigators. Serial killers typically worked alone, but here were two men, family members, who had teamed up. Extraditing Bianchi back to California, prosecutors now had to build a case not just against him, but against Buono as well. The trial that followed would become one of the longest and most expensive in California history. Bianchi eventually struck a deal, pleading guilty in Washington and agreeing to testify against Buono in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. His testimony painted Buono as the dominant partner, the one who pushed him deeper into violence, the one who set the rules for their spree. Buono denied everything, insisting he had no part in the crimes. But as evidence piled up, including Bianchi's testimony, fibers linking the victims to Buono's home, and patterns in the killings, the case against him grew stronger. The trial dragged on for 2 years. Jurors heard graphic details about how the women had been lured, abused, and killed. Families of the victims sat in the courtroom, forced to relive the horror as prosecutors laid out how the cousins had treated their daughters, sisters, and friends as disposable. In 1983, Angelo Buono was convicted of 9 murders. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Kenneth Bianchi was also sentenced to life, and both men would spend the rest of their lives behind bars. Buono died in prison in 2002. Bianchi remains incarcerated today in Washington state. The Hill Side Strangler case left scars on Los Angeles. It changed the way women moved through the city, making fear a part of everyday life during the late 1970s. It also exposed weaknesses in law enforcement, showing how jurisdictional divides and limited technology slowed the investigation. For criminologists, it became a landmark case, proof that serial killers could work in pairs and that manipulation could be just as deadly as physical violence. For the families of the victims, though, no conviction could undo the loss. Their daughters' names became part of a list that symbolized one of Los Angeles's darkest chapters. Even decades later, the case continues to haunt Los Angeles history. Documentaries, books, and TV shows revisit the story, often focusing on the psychological dynamic between Bianchi and Buono. People remain fascinated and horrified by the idea of 2 cousins turning murder into a twisted partnership. The hillside roads where bodies were once found are now busy with traffic, but for those who know the history, they carry an invisible weight. The Hillside Stranglers weren't just killers. They were a mirror of Los Angeles at a time when the city's sprawl made it easy for predators to hide in plain sight, when young women chasing dreams or simply walking home could be targeted without warning. The murders reminded the city that behind the glamour of Hollywood and the promise of opportunity, there was vulnerability and danger, and the memory of that terror, the panic that gripped Los Angeles for months, remains one of the darkest legacies in its history.